The first hard storm of the season came down out of the mountains a full month early, and it found Maren and her daughter on the open road, with nowhere left to knock. They had started the day with 4 doors ahead of them, and a little hope pinned to each one. By dusk all 4 had closed. Some closed gently, with a woman's tired apology through a gap in the frame. One closed hard, a bolt thrown before Maren had finished speaking. Word travels faster than a wagon on a frozen track, and the word that ran ahead of her was an ugly one. Folk said death followed the drifting healer. They said she had buried her own, and would bury the herd of anyone fool enough to let her near. A rumor like that needs no proof. It only needs a hard season and a frightened valley, and it had both. Junie lay in the wagon bed under every blanket they owned, and she was still cold. She was 8 years old and burning with a fever that would not break, and the cold was the one thing her mother could not doctor out of her. A fever wants warmth around it while the body fights. A wagon on an open plain in a rising wind gives none. Maren had watched the flush climb into her daughter's cheeks all afternoon. She had done the arithmetic that every parent dreads. The answer she kept reaching was that the girl needed a roof and a stove before morning, or there would be no morning to reach. So when the last light showed her a ranch down in the hollow, she turned the tired horse toward it, and she did not let herself think about the other doors. It was a hard place to look at. A good house once, she could tell, but a house that had stopped being tended. The barn was the only building with lamplight in it, and the light was the wrong color. Sickness has a color when it gets into a barn at night. A low, anxious amber that means men are up past their sleep because animals are going down. Maren knew that light before she was close enough to hear the coughing. There was coughing. Deep, wet, wrong. It came from the barn in a ragged chorus, and under it a single beast lay down in the straw, breathing like a torn bellows. A man came out of the barn with a lantern held high and a shotgun held low. He planted himself between her and the barn and watched her wagon roll in like it was one more piece of bad weather. "Keep going," he said. "Whatever you're selling, I've got no coin and no time for it." "I'm not selling," Maren said. She kept her hands where he could see them. "My girl has a fever. She's 8. She needs a stove and a wall for one night, and I'll take the barn or the yard. I don't care which. Just let her be warm till the fever turns." The man's jaw worked. He was near 40, bearded, worn down to the grain like the house behind him. His eyes went to the wagon bed, to the small shape under the blankets, and something crossed his face and was pushed away. "I've no room for a sick child," he said. "I've got sickness enough of my own." And there it hung in the cold between them, the sound coming out of his barn. Maren did not plead. Pleading was a coin she had spent all day, and it had bought her 4 closed doors. She listened to the barn instead, to that torn breathing and the wet chorus over it, and she named what she heard. It was lung fever in his cattle, she said, the wet cough, the ones going off their feed first, the heat that showed through the hide before a beast ever went down. She asked how many he had lost. 6, he said. 8, counting the 2 that would not see midnight. And how many head all told? 120. Then he was going to lose the 120, she said, because a sickness like that did not stop on its own. It ran the whole barn, and then it ran the county. She had seen it take a herd down to the last calf. She was a healer, she told him, and not only of people. Her husband had been the stock doctor for a territory 3 times the size of his valley, and she had worked every case at his elbow for 11 years. She knew what was killing his cattle, and she knew the handful of hard things that could stop it, and there was not another soul within a day's ride who could say as much. She let that sit. Then she made the offer that would either save her daughter or finish them both. "Warm my girl," Let her lie by your stove till the fever breaks, and I will save your herd, not for money, for a wall and a stove, and one night at a time. You keep her warm, I keep your cattle standing. That's the whole bargain." The wind took the smoke off his chimney and tore it flat. Somewhere behind him the torn breathing stopped and did not start again, and a hired man cursed low in the dark. The rancher's name was Elias, though Marin would not learn it for another hour. He stood there with a dead heifer cooling behind him, and a mortgage he could not carry, and a stranger telling him she could do the one thing he had prayed for. Every hard year he had lived told him to send her down the road. She was trouble, folk said so, and a woman who claimed to doctor cattle was either a fool or a fraud, and he had no patience left for either. But he was a man watching everything he owned drown in its own lungs, and drowning men do not get to be choosy about the rope. There was a downed heifer in the third stall, he said at last, his best, gone down an hour ago. If she was still alive when he walked Marin in, she could try. Get the cow up, and the child slept by his stove, and they would talk about the rest. But if the animal died while she knelt over it, the two of them were gone before he finished the burying. He would not have death sitting at his fire. "Fair," Marin said, and she was already climbing down. She carried Junie in first, because a bargain is only a bargain when both sides move, and she would not doctor his cattle with her daughter still freezing in a wagon. The house was cold and gray inside, a house where a woman used to live and did not anymore, and the stove had been let down to embers. Marin built it up with her own hands, laid her daughter in the warmth of it, and pressed her mouth to the hot forehead. "You hold on," she whispered. "I've got work. I won't be far." "Don't go far," Junie said, thin as paper. "Never far," Marin said, "just out to the barn." Then she went to earn the fire. The downed heifer he led her to was a red cow with a white face, heavy in the shoulder, the kind a man builds a whole herd around. She lay on her side in the fouled straw, her breath coming in that same torn heave, her eye already going flat and far away. Elias stood at the rail with the lantern, and beside him stood the hired man, an old wire thin fellow named Boone, who eyed Marin as a farmer eyes a crow that has landed on his porch. "She's near gone," Boone said. "You're wasting the man's lamp oil." Marin did not answer him. She had her sleeves back and her hands on the cow before he finished talking, and everything she needed came up through her palms. The fever was there, banked high under the hide. The lungs were half full, but only half. The animal had gone down from the fear and the fever and the cold as much as from the fluid. And a beast that has given up will die on schedule unless you hand it a reason not to. "She's not gone," Marin said. "She's quit. There's a difference, and the second one I can argue with." What followed was not magic. Marin was careful never to let it look like magic, because men shown magic want more of it, and men shown work will pick up a rope and help. She called for hot water and clean sacking and the strongest coffee in the house, and she got Boone moving despite himself. She raised the heifer's head and shoulders and braced them high on a bale so the lungs could drain the way lungs are built to drain. A beast lying flat cannot drain at all. She worked the sacking, soaked and wrung near scalding, along the great muscles of the chest and throat, opening what the cold had clamped shut. She dosed the cow off a spoon with a bitter tincture from her bag, a thing she had boiled down herself out of bark and root, and she talked low the whole while, a steady voice meant for the animal and the two men both. The fever was the body's own fire, she told them, and not the enemy. The drowning was the enemy. Keep the head up, keep the chest warm and open, keep just enough water in her to hold the blood thin, and the fire would be given time to win. Half of doctoring, she said, was keeping a thing alive long enough to save itself. An hour passed. The heifer's breath eased by slow degrees. The heave shortened. The flat look drew back in until there was a cow behind the eye again, frightened and sick but present. And then, with Maren's shoulder under her, and Boone hauling on a sling of sacking he had stopped, pretending he was too proud to hold, the red heifer got her forelegs under her, and heaved up onto all four, and stood swaying in the lamplight, weak but on her feet. Boone let out a breath with a laugh buried in it. But Maren did not smile. "She's up. She isn't saved," she said. "I've bought her a night no more. The fever decides her now, not me. And a cow standing again is no proof I can read this thing. If you want that, watch this." She got to her feet and walked down the aisle, past the coughing, to a black cow near the far end. It stood square and clear-eyed and chewing, as sound to the eye as any beast Elias owned. Maren laid her hand flat along its flank, then up under the throat, and held it there. "This one drank at the trough beside the sick ones. 3 days running," she said. "The heat's just come up under the hide, too low for your eye to find. She looks like your soundest cow. By morning she'll be off her feed. By tomorrow night she'll be down. Mark the stall and watch her. If I'm wrong, I'll take my girl and go at first light and never trouble you again. If I'm right, you do exactly what I tell you with the rest of them, and you do it without arguing." Elias looked at the black cow, sound as a coin, and at the woman who had just staked her one night's shelter on it. Something in his hard face came loose at one corner. It was not belief yet. It was the front edge of it. "The child sleeps by the stove," he said. It was not thanks. It was a man paying a debt because he was the kind who paid them. "We'll talk about the rest at first light." "We'll talk now," Maren said, getting to her feet. "Wait for light, and you'll lose 10 more head by dawn. I did not raise your best cow off the floor to watch the others follow her down while we sleep." That was the night the bargain took hold. Not the words in the yard, but the red heifer standing in that stall with her ribs heaving and her feet under her. A promise is only wind. It was the cow on her feet that made Elias listen, and because he listened that night instead of at dawn, everything that came after was possible at all. For Maren had told him the plain truth in the yard. The sickness would not stop on its own. And stopping it was going to cost him things he did not think he could stand to lose. Before the winter was out, folk would come down the road to this failing ranch with their hats in their hands. But that lay months off, past a great deal of loss and one bitter argument, and a night that nearly broke the whole bargain in two. On this first night, there was only a fevered girl by a stove, a sick herd in a cold barn, and a woman who knew exactly what it would take, standing in the straw, rolling her sleeves back down against the cold. They talked in the barn with the lantern turned up, and what Maren told him he did not want to hear. He had 3 kinds of cattle under his roof, she said, walking the aisle, laying a hand on this beast and that one, and reading each through her palm. He had the sick, coughing and off their feed. He had the well, that still looked fine. And he had a third kind, the worst kind, that carried the fever inside and showed nothing yet. Those were the ones that would fool him. He would think a stall was clean and leave it be, and in 2 days it would go down and take the 4 stalls around it. "Then what do I do?" Elias said, "if I can't even see which is which?" She told him to stop treating them like one herd. One herd in one barn, all breathing one another's air, was exactly how a sickness like this ate everything in front of it. So they would break the herd apart that same night. The sick and the near sick to one end, downwind, in the stalls nearest the big doors where the air moved. The well to the far end, and past them, out in the old calving shed she had seen leaning at the edge of the yard, the ones that still looked strong would go into hard quarantine. No hand that had touched a sick beast would touch them. They would be watered from a separate bucket and walked to by a separate path. "You'll freeze the strong ones out in that shed," Boone said. "There's gaps in it you could throw a dog through." "Then they would chink the gaps that night," Marin answered, "with straw and mud and old sacking, whatever came to hand." A beast could stand cold. Cold on its own did not kill a healthy cow with a full belly and a windbreak. But warm and crowded and breathing sickness would kill every last one, and do it inside a week. They were trading a little heat for a great deal of air, and doing it on purpose, because to her reading moving air gave the sickness far less to ride on than the close warm breath of a crowded barn. Warmth and crowding seemed to feed the fever, in everything she had seen of it. Space and clean air seemed to work against it. They would choose space and pay for it in blankets and hay, and keep the strong ones strong by keeping them apart. It was the water that told her she was right, and the water that told her something worse. There was one long trough down the middle of the barn, fed off the creek, and every animal in the place drank from it. She had them drain it, and she got down and studied the muck at the bottom. And she went quiet, in a manner that brought Elias to stand over her. "What?" he said. "How many of the sick ones drank here first, before you knew to worry?" "All of them. It's the only trough. Creek's gone thin and foul at the bank." "That trough was one of the roads the sickness traveled," she said, "and maybe the busiest one. What came up out of the sick beasts could settle in the standing water, and the next animal drank it straight down. One trough for 120 head was a single grave they were all leaning in to sip from. She could not swear it was the whole of how the thing spread, only that it was a road they could close. And closing every road they could find was the whole of the work. So they would split the water the same as the herd. The sick would drink from their own buckets, downwind, boiled where it could be boiled. The well herd would take clean water hauled from the wellhead, not a drop off that creek, not a mouthful a sick muzzle had been near. And the long trough would be scrubbed out with lye and left standing dry. That was the first hour, and the plan so far cost nothing but sweat, and men will spend sweat. It was the next thing she told him that nearly ended everything. 3 head in the sick end were past saving, she said, low, so the words would not carry to Boone. The roan steer, the little bull, and the spotted cow with the sunk eye, their lungs were gone. They would not come back, and every hour they stayed in that barn they could breathe out enough sickness to drown 10 more. They had to be put down that night, and their bodies hauled well off and burned, not buried. Buried, the ground could stay foul, and a thaw might bring the sickness back up in the spring. Burned, there was far less left for it to come back from. Elias stared at her. The little bull cost me $40 I didn't have. He's the one animal on this place that might have built the herd back. He is the one animal on this place that is going to empty it. Marin said, I am sorry. I know what he was worth. But he is worth nothing now except as a road for the fever to reach the 50 head that can still live. Keep him because you can't stand to lose him, and he will cost you all 50. You don't know that. I have watched it happen, Marin said, and for the first time her steady voice had an edge under it, an old grief showing through. I stood in a barn just like this one and let a man talk me out of the burning because he couldn't bear it. I buried his herd with him 3 weeks later, and I buried more than his herd. Do not ask me to do the soft thing twice. The soft thing is the thing that kills them all. The argument ran longer than it should have, because a man losing everything reaches for the one refusal still left to him. Elias would put the 3 down, he said, but he would bury them decent, out past the calving shed, and be done. Marin told him again that she had seen buried sickness come back with a spring thaw, and that she would not gamble the herd on this lot lying quiet in the ground. Elias said the ground was his, and the cattle were his, and the choosing was his. And for one long moment the whole bargain hung on that thread, a proud man against a stranger's certainty, with a fevered child asleep by his stove as the only thing binding them. It was Boone, in the end, who turned it. The old hand had drifted near enough to hear, as old hands do, and he spoke up out of the dark of the aisle where neither of them had known he stood. "I was here for the last one, Elias," he said quietly. "Winter of the bad year. Your daddy buried the sick ones out past the fence line because he couldn't stand the smell of the burning. You remember what came up in that pasture come spring. You remember what it did to us." He worked his jaw. "She's telling you the same thing your daddy learned too late." I'd listen to it this time. Elias looked at the old man a long moment. Then he looked at the barn, at the aisle full of coughing, at the amber light that meant nobody would sleep. And the fight went out of his shoulders, not into surrender, but into work, which is where a decent man puts it. "Start the burning well off the water," he said. "Downwind of the house. I won't have the child breathing it." He took up a maul and a length of rope. "I'll do the 3 myself. A man ought to do his own hard killing." He stopped at the little bull's stall and stood there a breath, and then did the thing that needed doing, and he did not make Marin watch. They worked the whole night through. They split the herd end to end, sick from well from strong. They chinked the calving shed by lantern until the wind stopped whistling through it, and the strong cattle stood quiet out of the killing draft. They drained and scoured the long trough and hauled clean water from the wellhead, bucket after bucket, until Marin's arms shook with it. They burned the 3 that could not be saved, well off and downwind, and sent the worst of the contagion up into the night as smoke and ash. By the next morning, the black cow she had marked was off her feed, standing with her head low in the corner of her stall. By the following evening she was down, coughing wet, exactly as Marin had called it out of a beast that had looked sound as any on the place. Elias stood at that stall a long time. Boone stopped calling her the stray after that, and Elias stopped weighing her words before he did what they told him. The plan was tested before it was 3 days old. A hard little squall came through in the night and tore the chinking loose along the north wall of the calving shed. By the time Boone found it at dawn, the cold had driven the strong cattle to bunch in one corner, crowding warm the exact way the sickness wanted them to. Marin was there within the minute. They did not simply nail the wall shut and leave it. She had them spread the strong herd wide again and drive fresh bedding under them. Then she had them stand a windbreak of stacked hay bales against the north side, so the beasts would keep their distance even when the wind pushed. A design that only held in calm weather was no design at all, she said. It had to hold on the worst night, because the worst night was the one it was built for. They rebuilt it to hold on the worst night. And once in the small hours she went in to her daughter and found the fever broken, the girl sleeping soft and cool by the banked stove with a barn cat curled in the crook of her knee. She stood over her a while. Then she went back out into the cold and the work, because the bargain ran both ways, and her half of it was nowhere near done. The sickness did not stop the next morning, because sickness never does. It stopped over 11 days, the way a fire dies once its fuel is gone. The sick end lost 4 more head that first week, the ones already too far along when Marin arrived, and each loss was a body hauled off and burned, and a stall scrubbed to the bare wood with lye. But the well herd, down in the far stalls, held, and the strong herd in the chinked calving shed, watered clean and touched by no sick hand, did not put up a single cough. Day by day the counting changed. Fewer new fevers, fewer beasts going off their feed. A morning came when Boone walked the whole sick end and found nothing new down, and he stood in the aisle and took off his hat, which for Boone was a kind of prayer. Marin taught the whole time, because a thing a man only watches he cannot repeat, and she did not mean to stay at this ranch forever. She showed Elias how to read a fever through the hide before a beast went off its feed. She showed him the drainage, the head held high, the chest kept warm and open while the air stayed cold and moving. She showed him why the boiled water and the separate buckets mattered more than any tincture in her bag. Half of what she knew was not medicine at all. It was arrangement. Where a thing stood, what it breathed, what it drank, who touched it, and in what order. Engineering, her husband had called it. A plague was not out-doctored, he used to say. It was out-built. It was Junie, mending fast by the stove, and bored as only a mending child can be, who turned up the root of the whole thing. She had taken to trailing Boone on his rounds, and she had a child's sharp memory for a brand. One afternoon she came running to find her mother out in the calving shed. "Mama, the sick ones and the well ones have different marks," she said. "The sick ones are all the same one. It's a letter with a bar under it. Boone says that mark isn't ours." Marin went and looked, and the girl was right. She walked the sick end stall by stall. Near every animal breathing that torn wet breath wore the same brand burned into its hip, a letter with a bar beneath it. Not one of them had been born on this ranch. The bar brand cattle, she asked Elias that evening, where had they come from? He looked up slow. "Bought cheap in the fall," he said. 40 head off a rancher the next valley over. A man named Price who was selling down, claiming he was thinning for winter. The price had been too good to walk past. His face changed as he said it, with the look a man gets when a thing he has long refused to see finally stands up in front of him. "They were the ones that had gone down first," he said. "Every last one of them." "They had not gone down first because they were unlucky," Marin told him. "They had gone down first because they came sick." Price had not been thinning for winter. He had been emptying a broken barn onto whoever would pay, getting his fever off his own land and onto another man's before it ate him. That was why it had moved so fast. Elias had not caught a plague out of the cold. He had bought one. And then she told him the rest, because he had earned the truth of her, and because the brand had opened the door to it. She told him about the settlement 3 winters back, where she and her husband had come to the same fight in the same kind of barn. The man who owned the herd could not stand the burning, and he buried his sick decent. Come the spring thaw, the sickness came back through his valley, or something close enough to it that she had never stopped believing the two were one. And before that year was done with them, it took her husband too. Not the cattle fever itself, but a cut he had taken to the bone in the burning work. A wound that went bad and burned him up with a fever no tincture in her bag could turn. The settlement needed someone to carry a grief that size, and it settled on the healer's widow, who was left standing. The story had walked ahead of her ever since, down every road, to every bolted door. Death follows her. It was never death that followed her. It was the memory of a burning that came too late, and the certainty bought at the highest price there is, of what it costs to do the soft thing. Folk shut their doors because they believed she carried the sickness, she said. She did not carry the sickness. She carried the cure, and the cure was ugly, and most would sooner bury a herd gently than save it hard. His neighbor Price had shut a gate in her face the same day Elias opened one. Price had looked at her fevered child and told her to move along, an hour before she came down into the hollow. Elias was quiet a long while. Price had sold him the fever, he said at last, and turned her girl out into it, the same afternoon. He had, she answered. Then I hope the winter finds him honest, Elias said, and there was nothing kind in it. The winter found everyone honest. That is what winter is for. It came down in the last week of the year, the real cold. Not the early freeze that had chased Marin to the hollow, but the deep killing weight of it. It did to the valley what Marin had spent a month teaching Elias to prevent. The mercury fell past 20 below and stayed there. The creek froze to the stones. And in barn after barn up and down the valley, the cattle that had wintered the old way went down all at once. They had been crowded warm, breathing one another over a single shared trough. By Marin's reading, the fever Price had helped scatter when he sold off his broken herd had likely been moving quietly through the valley all autumn, and the deep cold gave it every advantage. Price lost his herd in 9 days. He had emptied his sick barn onto his neighbors and held back his young stock. And the young stock carried what he had never truly stamped out. And when the killing cold came, it ran through them like fire through dry grass. Up and down the valley it was the same. Herds that had stood 100 strong at first snow lay frozen in the drifts by midwinter, and their owners walked the white pastures at dawn counting the dead. And down in the hollow, on the failing ranch that folk had written off, the fight for the herd came to its worst single night. It fell near the turn of the year, when the cold dropped past anything the valley had a name for. The wellhead froze first. Boone came pounding in from the yard to say the pump had seized solid, and the strong herd out in the calving shed had no water and was starting to bunch against the cold, crowding warm in the corner in the exact manner that had nearly cost them the shed weeks before. It was the crisis Marin had drilled them for, and they did not lose their heads over it. Elias built a fire under the wellhead to thaw the pump, while Marin and Boone waded into the shed and broke the bunch apart by hand, driving the cattle wide and forking dry bedding under them. Then Elias made the hardest call of the winter. He climbed to the hay mow and pitched down the last of the reserve he had been hoarding against spring, the whole of it, so the beasts could burn feed for their own warmth and hold their distance instead of huddling for it. They spent the night at it, thawing water a bucket at a time, keeping the herd spread and fed in a cold that killed lesser things where they stood. And when the gray light came, every animal on the place was still on its feet. That was the shape of the whole winter, made in 1 night and 100 nights like it. The herd stood the best chance it could be given, because it had been broken apart before the cold, watered as clean as they could keep it, and never let to crowd tight over its own breath. The other herds met that freeze already crowded, already weakened, already carrying the sickness with nothing done to slow it. And the cold found them out as cold always finds the weak. There was a morning near the low point of the cold when Elias walked his own fence line at first light. The breath froze white on his beard. He counted his cattle standing dark and steaming against the snow, while smoke from a dozen far chimneys rose over barns that held nothing living anymore. He had gone into the winter expecting to bury everything he owned. He came out the far side of it, with his herd on its feet. When the counting was done across the whole White Valley, 1 herd had come through the killing freeze near Hole. His, the ranch they had all been sure was finished, held the only living cattle left between the mountains, and every soul in the valley believed they knew why. They came down the road after that, just as Marin had promised on the first night, when it had sounded like a mad woman's boast. They came with their hats in their hands. Men who had bolted their doors against a sick child, and her mother came now to that same mother. Their own calves were dying. They had all heard that the drifting healer folk once called bad luck had carried 1 ranch through Hole. They stood in the yard where Elias had first raised a gun at her wagon, and they asked her to come look at what was left of their herds, and to tell them what could be done. Price came too, at the end, when he had nothing left. He stood in the same yard he had once driven her from, and he could not lift his eyes to hers. "They tell me you can stop it," he said. "I can slow it," Marin answered. "You're too far gone to stop. You'd have had to start in the fall, before you sold your sickness to a man who took in a stranger's child the same night you put one out." She let him stand in that. Then, because she was not built as he was, she told him to bring his young stock in the morning. What could be saved, she would help him save. She did not burn people down, she said. Only fevers. She rode to the valley's herds all that hard winter, on Elias's good horse. She taught barn after barn the ugly hard cure, the splitting and the burning and the clean cold water. She pulled more cattle through the deep of it than anyone had a right to expect. The story that ran ahead of her down the roads changed as she rode. It was no longer death that followed the healer. It was the woman who had stood one ranch through the winter that emptied all the rest, and the doors that had shut on her began, one by one, to open before she even reached them. But she always came back to the hollow, because that was where her girl was, and because a place had made itself for her there without either of them quite saying so. Junie never left the ranch again. By the deep of winter she called the barn cat her own, and the red heifer her own, and she called Elias by his name. And then one evening, without deciding to, by a warmer word than his name. Elias did not correct her. He had buried a wife in that house, and shut it up like a grave. Then a fevered child and her hard-handed mother had come in out of the cold and lit the stove he had let go to embers, and the house was a house again. He said it plainly, once, as he did everything. "You bargained a warm corner for my herd," he told Marin, on a night the wind was up and all three of them were inside it and warm. "You saved the herd, and the corner's yours as long as you want it. But I'd sooner you took the whole house and stayed, and not for any bargain. The place doesn't work without the two of you in it anymore, and I'm too old to pretend I don't know it." Marin looked at her daughter asleep by the stove, cool and safe, in the warm heart of a house that had once shut its door on them both. "We'll stay," she said. So his was the herd that lived. The winter the valley froze, and the woman-folk had turned out into the cold, became the one they rode miles to reach. She had come to his gate with nothing but 2 hands, a sick child, and a certainty no one wanted to hear. And she had traded all 3 for a wall and a stove, and, in the end, a home. If she had knelt at your gate that first freezing night, a stranger with muck to her elbows and a fevered girl in the wagon and a promise that sounded like madness, would you have thrown the bolt like the 4 before you? Or would you have opened the door and let the winter show you which of you was right?